Welcome to Understanding the Holocaust, Part 2, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. In September 1939, World War II began in Europe when Germany invaded Poland, triggering declarations of war from France and Great Britain. The United States would stay out of the war for the next 2 years. Over the next 3 years, the Nazis executed a blitzkrieg, or lightning war, that brought almost all of Europe under the control of the Third Reich and its Axis partners. Before, only the Jews living in German territory had been victims of Hitler's persecution. Now, wherever Nazi soldiers conquered, Jews across Europe were treated just as harshly. In Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Poland, in France, which fell to Germany in 1940, and even in the Soviet Union, which Hitler invaded in 1941. Jews in all these places, and more, had to register with their governments for easy identification. They were required to wear this symbol, a yellow version of the six-pointed Star of David, on their clothing at all times. If they didn't, they would be severely punished. In 1941, after the Nazi army invaded and occupied the eastern parts of the Soviet Union, special death squads rounded up Russian Jews, as well as gypsies and communists, in the areas they conquered. Rather than taking them as prisoners, many were simply shot and buried in mass graves. As many as 1.5 million people may have died in this manner. Elsewhere in Europe, the Holocaust entered a new and deadlier phase. New camps were being prepared throughout the Third Reich, most of them in Poland. With names like Treblinka and Auschwitz, these were different from the concentration camps that already existed in Germany, the purpose of which was to concentrate prisoners for slave labor. These camps were built with gas chambers for mass killings and crematoria, high-temperature ovens, for the disposal of dead bodies. They were death camps. In 1942, Nazi officials met at a secret conference. Among other topics, they made plans for the final solution to what their regime called the Jewish problem. The final solution was the Nazis' euphemism, a gentler term, for state-sponsored genocide. The materials for mass murder were already under construction. While the death camps were being built, Jews across Europe were forced into segregated neighborhoods called ghettos. In some, Jews were allowed to come and go without permission. In others, they weren't allowed to leave at all. The largest ghetto was in Warsaw, Poland. Close to 500,000 Jews were confined to a tiny area of the city by walls topped with barbed wire, where they were guarded at all times. In mid-1942, most of the Jews in Warsaw's ghetto were loaded into cattle cars too crowded for passengers to even sit down. They were told they were being deported to work camps for the remainder of the war. Those who survived the journey disembarked in camps like Treblinka. They would be killed shortly after their arrival. Some camps, like Auschwitz in Poland, were concentration camps for prisoners, as well as extermination camps. There, prisoners were sorted into 2 groups. Those who could work and those who were too young, too old, or too weak. The latter group was told they would be taking showers after their long journey to the camp. Sometimes they were given towels or bars of soap to maintain the illusion. Once stripped of their clothes, victims were herded into shower rooms that were locked behind them. Then, poison gas, hydrogen cyanide, was pumped in. Victims of the gas chambers took 20 minutes to die, sometimes longer. Their bodies were cremated and the ashes disposed of. The Nazis did not want to leave behind evidence in the form of mass graves. Auschwitz was truly a factory of death. Up to 12,000 people a day could be murdered using this method. Of the total number of Jewish victims of the Holocaust, it is estimated that about half were gassed to death. The Third Reich had in place a highly bureaucratic society that could organize murder on such a massive scale. The Holocaust may have had its genesis in the hatred of one man, Adolf Hitler, but in the end, it was carried out by hundreds of thousands of willing participants, people who took orders from, received paychecks from, and were committed to the success of the Nazi regime. And across occupied Europe, the Nazis had many collaborators who were willing to cooperate with the regime as its accomplices, delivering Jewish victims to the Germans. It should be noted that throughout the Holocaust, some people did resist the Nazis and protected Jews in whatever way they could, at great personal risk to themselves. For example, after the Nazis occupied neighboring Denmark in 1940, the Danish king refused to discriminate against his country's Jewish population, as Hitler wanted. When German police began hunting for Jews, the government and citizens of Denmark carried out a massive operation to shelter them and even help them escape the country. Danish Jews were ferried across the ocean to neutral Sweden, where they found safety. Because of these efforts, less than 1% of Denmark's Jews became victims of the Holocaust, the lowest percentage of any nation occupied by the Nazis. Stories like these show that even against the backdrop of great evil, many people risked their own lives to bravely defy the Nazis' cult of death. You've learned already that although the Nazi Third Reich specifically targeted Jews for genocide, almost half the victims of the Holocaust, about 5 million out of a total of 11 million, were not Jewish. In concentration camps, an elaborate system of badges worn by prisoners marked who was who. This upside-down red triangle meant that the person was a political prisoner. The P inside marked him or her as Polish. This purple triangle meant that the prisoner was a Jehovah's Witness. A brown triangle marked one as a gypsy. This pink triangle, with a yellow one inside it to form a 6-pointed star, meant that the prisoner was a homosexual and a Jew. Why were these other groups persecuted by the Nazis? Some Holocaust victims were people who were physically or mentally disabled. Hitler was obsessed with racial purity, and he wanted to create a superior master race by eliminating certain people from the gene pool so they could not reproduce. So some handicapped people, as well as those with mental problems, were targeted for mercy killings early in the war years. Hitler also despised gypsies, the name for various tribes, such as the Roma and the Sinti, whose ethnic origins lay in India many centuries in the past. Like Jews, gypsies lacked their own nation and were a minority group that faced discrimination and prejudice almost everywhere they settled in Europe. Also like Jews, most became prisoners or were sent to extermination camps. Historians believe that about 220,000 gypsies, 1/4 of the population in Europe before the war, were murdered in the Holocaust. Hitler considered the Slavic people of Europe, including Poles and Russians, to be genetically inferior. As the Nazis invaded those areas of Europe, millions, Jews and non-Jews, were killed or sent to the camps. Poland and the Soviet Union account for more victims of the Holocaust than any other nations. In Poland, 3 million or more are estimated to have died, including 90% of Poland's Jewish population. In Soviet Russia, the number is estimated to be 1 million or more, with millions of additional victims if prisoner of war deaths are taken into account. These casualties are far greater than those from other nations, including Germany, and they reflect the Nazis' unique hatred for Slavic peoples. Other Holocaust victims represented religious groups that Hitler considered unusual or defiant. Jehovah's Witnesses were a Christian group that, because of their beliefs, refused to salute the Nazi flag or say Heil Hitler. They also refused military service. For this, many Jehovah's Witnesses who would not renounce their beliefs were sent to the camps, where thousands died. Homosexuals, at least those in Germany, were persecuted for what the Nazis considered a deviant lifestyle. As many as 15,000 were arrested for their sexuality and became Holocaust victims. Hitler distrusted the Freemasons, a fraternal society with secretive and mysterious practices dating back many centuries. The Nazis came to believe the Masons were a cult that had succumbed to the Jews. At least 80,000 Freemasons were estimated to have died in the camps. The stories of those who lived through the Holocaust, or became its victims, are each unique in their horrors. Here are 3 young people whose stories reveal different aspects of the Holocaust. Liesl Winternitz was born in 1926 into a Jewish family in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. When she was 12, the Germans occupied Prague and introduced harsh laws against the Jewish population. She remembered a teacher spitting in her face at school and calling her a dirty, filthy Jew. In 1942, Liesl and her parents were deported to a Jewish ghetto, where they learned that they were among 5,000 names on a list to be sent to the Auschwitz camp in Poland. Liesl's brother Peter volunteered to go instead, allowing her to remain in the ghetto, where she spent the rest of the war making gas masks for the German army. Liesl survived the Holocaust, but she later learned that her brother and both her parents died at Auschwitz. Henoch Kornfeld was born in 1938 to Jewish parents in Kolbazowa, Poland. He was only a year old when the Germans invaded and easily defeated the Polish army. For the next 3 years, his hometown was controlled by a German police commander who terrorized and sometimes murdered the local Jews. Henoch would even play a game with his childhood friends, pretending to be the German commander and telling them if you are a Jew, you are dead, then shooting them with a wooden rifle. In 1942, Henoch and his family were deported to a ghetto and then sent to the Belzec extermination camp, where they were gassed to death. He was 3.5 years old. Anne Frank is probably the best-known victim of the Holocaust. She was born in Germany in 1929, but after Hitler came to power, her family moved to the Netherlands, only to have Amsterdam, their new home, invaded by the Nazis during the war. To avoid detection, the Franks, along with another family, went into hiding in some concealed rooms in the building where Anne's father worked. A few employees brought them food and news of the outside world. If discovered, they might have faced the death penalty for concealing Jews. For more than 2 years, Anne did not leave the apartment. She wrote vividly of her experiences in a diary. In 1944, an informant, whose identity remains unknown, betrayed the Franks and their friends. They were arrested and separated, and 1 month later, Anne was in Auschwitz. She avoided the gas chambers there, but in 1945, Anne was relocated to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where she died of disease not long before British soldiers liberated the camp. Otto Frank, Anne's father, was the only survivor from the family, and he recovered her diary and had it published after the war. The book is still widely read today and has been adapted into movies and a stage play. By 1941, the United States had joined World War II on the side of the Allies after Japan's sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. America, along with Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations, was committed to the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. As early as 1942, American intelligence first began to hear reports of the death camps and the Nazis' final solution. Some thought that the reports were exaggerated. Certainly, they were hard to believe. There was little that could be done at that time. The Allies were still years away from being able to invade Europe and liberate the people there. That included victims of the Holocaust. But the U.S. State Department chose to keep the reports a secret from the public, which meant to that most Americans, the Holocaust existed as just a rumor. And even after 1942, the State Department kept in place the restrictive policies that made it difficult for Jewish refugees to enter the United States. In 1943, leaders from Britain and the U.S. met to discuss options for helping Europe's Jews. They concluded that the best way to end the Holocaust was to defeat Hitler and win the war as soon as possible. Not everyone agreed. Some, including prominent Jewish leaders in the U.S., wanted to accuse the Nazis of crimes against humanity. The U.S. Office of War Information, responsible for wartime information and propaganda, disagreed. The OWI thought the accusations might encourage German resistance and prolong the war. By 1944, the Allies were able to send planes deep inside Europe on bombing raids, meant to destroy Axis resources and infrastructure. Some suggested bombing the death camps, or at least the railroad tracks that led to them. The British and American militaries were reluctant to do this. They argued that the Allied air forces could not spare resources that could be otherwise used to attack military targets. And they pointed out, not incorrectly, that bombing the camps would almost certainly kill innocent people being held there. The reality, of course, was that those prisoners were likely to die one way or another. The Holocaust ended in 1945, as World War II drew to a close, when Allied armies closed in on Germany from all sides. As American and British forces entered Germany from the west, and the Soviet Red Army attacked from the east, the Allies came upon camps that had been hurriedly abandoned by the Nazis. They discovered gas chambers and crematoria still filled with human remains. Entire warehouses held clothes, shoes, jewelry, even human hair, all taken from the victims. In many cases, survivors, sick and starving, had been left behind. They told their stories to the soldiers who liberated them, and the full extent of the Holocaust began to be known. In April 1945, American troops in Germany discovered Ohrdruf, a subcamp of the concentration camp called Buchenwald. Almost all the prisoners had been evacuated or killed when the Nazis left the camp the month before. The soldiers discovered piles of bodies left behind. Some had been burned, others had been covered in lime to slow their decomposition. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Head of Allied Command in Europe, visited the camp himself with fellow generals George Patton and Omar Bradley. Eisenhower wrote to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington about his experience. The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, where they were piled up 20 or 30 naked men, killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said that he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately, in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. That same month, April, the Soviets conquered Berlin, and Adolf Hitler, along with other top Nazis, committed suicide. The war in Europe would be over within a week. After World War II ended, and the horrors of the Holocaust became undeniable public knowledge, the entire world was forced to grapple with what had happened in Europe. Prominent Nazis and their accomplices who survived the war were later put on trial in Nuremberg, Germany. 22 were indicted for war crimes, and 185 others for crimes against humanity. Some of those found guilty were themselves put to death. For the Jews who survived, both in Europe and around the world, there rose a new call for Zionism, the creation of a Jewish nation in the Middle East. In 1948, the State of Israel was created, formed from territory of the former British Mandate of Palestine. Israel welcomed Jewish Holocaust survivors and displaced persons from around the world. Many other Jews chose to settle in the United States, which passed laws after the war, making it much easier for refugees to come to America. Humanity still continues to grapple with the questions raised by the Holocaust. In the heart of civilized Europe, in the modern 20th century, human beings carried out systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored genocide against 11 million other human beings. Many others allowed it to happen, or did not do all they could to have stopped it. You now have a better understanding of what the Holocaust is, and why and how it happened. But in the end, how could the Holocaust have happened is a question that defies easy understanding. Those who study the Holocaust are forced to grapple with the darkest aspects of human nature, as you have in this tutorial. Perhaps the best we can do is to learn about what happened, to never forget, and to pass it on to others. In this way, all of humanity can ensure that never again will this evil be repeated.